So a couple of things. If the screen goes out here shortly, we just realized we didn't have an extra charger for the computer, and it's got like 4%, so it may go out here in a minute, but that's okay. You've got paper and the bulletins. We're looking at this idea of what it means, how we center ourselves. This is us has been sort of a theme of everything from we are community, we are compassionate, and we care for one another. We proclaim our message. We proclaim good news, and these different kinds of themes that are us. And today this is us. This theme is how we center ourselves on God, and the sort of the activity is worship, is how we do that often here in this space or in the church's space. But for us, I want to think a little bit differently about worship. And so I'm going to sort of give you a little bit of background as we get into this. So these two texts that we read, this one text from Amos is a classic text, it's 2,500 years old, time of rule in the northern kingdom, and Amos is preaching to the northern kingdom, and the temple worship has gotten to be more oriented around power and around oppressiveness. And Amos comes out and begins to challenge them, and he prophesies in God's voice, right? He's a speaker for God, and so he says, as God's speaking through him, I hate your worship. Your celebrations disgust me. Your offerings are totally meaningless. Stop the noisiness with your singing. And then what he says is, let justice roll down like a waterfall. Let it roll down that freely, that openly. Let justice just flood things. Let compassion be like a river. So he's prophesying, he's challenging the people that they've kind of lost track of what worship is. Now, it's interesting to think about worship. I'm going to give you a quick little background here, too, because when you think about worship in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we go all the way back to Amos, or prior to that, to monotheism and the Hebrew people celebrating Yahweh in the Mesopotamian Valley in that area. What you have is this sense early on with Abraham, with Moses, is the Ark of the Covenant, the commandments, the Ten Commandments, the Ark of the Covenant. This is the covenant between God and the people, but they were nomadic. So they carried the ark with them. So God was present with them as they carried the ark. And then as they became more centralized as a society, as a culture, God became localized in the temple worship. And we have texts and books in the Bible which describe how temple worship shall now take place. I will no longer be with you out in the desert. I will be here at the temple. And that continues for a time until it's overrun. The Hebrew people are overrun by the Babylonians or by someone else. Then the temple's rebuilt. But temple worship becomes the locale. So that when you seek God for your forgiveness or God for your hope or for your future, you made pilgrimages to the temple. And then you made offerings, sacrifices of your best animals, for example. That got out of hand, right? So by the time of Amos, it was no longer about justice and compassion toward those who have less or to those who are oppressed. It was more about the temple became the center of things. And it became sort of a hiding place for power brokerage, if you will, in a sense. So then we come 500 years this direction, about 2,000 years ago, and we've got Jesus. And Jesus is doing the same thing in our text in John. Jesus, just prior to this, is a well-known story where Jesus is going into the temple. He's come into Jerusalem, and he goes into the temple courtyard where you buy and prepare sacrifices and offerings into the temple. And he goes in there and sees money changers, and he sees the various people selling the animals, and he starts to lose his temper. And he throws tables in every direction, and he turns the money changer tables upside down. He scatters the animals in every direction. He chases the various folks out of this area, out of the temple area. And he says, you've made my Father's house a den of thieves. But what he's complaining about, what he's challenging, aren't the sort of folks who are out there bartering or brokering for sacrifices, because that was needed. That was expected. What wasn't expected is that the very people who were colluding with Rome to tax and overtax the Hebrew people were hiding in those spaces. They literally had become a den of thieves. And so the power behind some of this oppressiveness was now hiding behind religion. I only say that because it hasn't changed. You know, it really hasn't changed today. We still find people in power hiding behind religion. And Jesus chases them out and says, this is not what worship is about. So I'm going to, of course, and then they ask him what authority he's able to do this by, and he tells them that I am going to tear this down and in 3 days rise it back up. We'll get back to that in a second. So I'm going to share with you a few ideas around this idea of the church-wide theme of how we center our lives on God and how we do that in worship. But I want to tell you a quick little story from Ireland that I heard from a guy named Peter Rollins. So this may help to illustrate where I'm going to go with this. Maybe not. I hope it will. So in the time of the Troubles, early 19-teens and 1920s, in the time of the Troubles, the British would often come over from England, from the UK, with new battalions of troops. And they would go to Belfast, and that was sort of like the central location of where they would base themselves to try to keep order with the Catholic and the Irish in Northern Ireland. And for fun sometimes, the battalion leader would take some of the soldiers to a local pub and look for a gullible Irishman and sort of take advantage of him to entertain the troops. And so on one afternoon, he and about a half dozen or so soldiers, they went to this pub and they were looking for just the right Irishman. And there, sitting at the end of the bar with a pint of Guinness, was this fellow looking a little bit gullible and halfway to the moon. And so he said, this one will do, this one will do. And he walked up, and the battalion leader took out a shiny gold pound, just a single pound coin, and he placed it on the table. And then he took out a crumpled 5-pound note, just a papered 5-pound note, crumpled up and kind of messy looking. He put that next to the gold coin. And he says, excuse me, sir. He says, fella, I will give you whichever one of these you want. Which one do you want? Do you want the shiny gold coin? Do you want the crumpled up note? And so the Irishman looks at it for a moment, and then he picks up the gold coin and he eyes it carefully and inspects it with all sorts of seriousness, and then even bites it. And he looks at it and he says, I'll take the gold coin. Puts it in his pocket, and the battalion leader chuckles, and he looks back at his mates, and they're all laughing that the guy passed up the 5-pound note. And he says, all right, well, good choice. He takes his 5-pound note, and he walks back over, and they all share another pint. And a little while later, they find another Irishman who's been sitting over there, and they walk over to him, and they do the same thing. And this goes on, 2 or 3 different fellas, and they all look at the gold coin, and they all say, oh, I'd rather have the gold coin. And they take the gold coin, and the Englishmen are all laughing and having a great time at this. And then they leave the place. Well, there's an American woman that had been sitting nearby. And she comes over, and she was probably in the area doing some ancestry research or something, you know. And so she walks up to the Irishman, and she says, I don't get it. I mean, surely you know that a 5-pound note, even crumpled up, is worth more value than a gold coin. And the Irishman says, yes, but if we ever take the note, they'll stop playing the game. So I want to think about with you this idea of worship. And the reason why I even tell this story is because I want there may be a little bit of magic, a little bit of sleight of hand, and perhaps some outright deceit that's involved. And because on the one hand, we all know what worship is supposed to look like, or at least those of us who grew up in the church in the Western world and been going to church for some time, we know what worship is supposed to look like, right? I mean, we've been in the church a long time. We know what it traditionally looks like. But on the other hand, maybe we don't know anymore. Maybe because we haven't gotten it for a long time now, because we've been outside of the traditional church perhaps. Many of us kept going to church even though we no longer really got it. It no longer made particular sense to us, and so we continued to go. Or maybe we gave up, in fact. I suspect there's some of you that gave up going to church after a while because it stopped making sense. And for some, church out and out seemed like a scene from The Wizard of Oz, just waiting for the moment when the dog finally went over to the side and pulled back the curtain. And so some of us left the church when that finally happened. Now, I'm in no way trying to suggest that church is a waste of time, that church is a sleight of hand, that worship is a sleight of hand, and that worship experiences are propaganda. Though in a lot of places that's exactly what it is. It seems religion has always had this dark side to it, this refusal to call out the emperor's nakedness or expose the man or woman who's behind the curtain. And in our text today, that's exactly what we hear Amos doing and exactly what we hear Jesus doing. 500 years later, Jesus is taking and turning things over and saying, this is not what worship is supposed to be about. And he's not challenging necessarily the idea of worship, but what he is challenging is the idea of hiding power and manipulation behind worship. I was just reading a report from, I want to say it was from the Gallup polls, but now I'm not sure. It was a political poll that recently came out. And what was interesting was it listed all of the politicians and their religious affiliation. And out of all of the Congress people and the senators and everything, there was only one person that admitted being an atheist. And I found that really interesting. Another person abstained and just said none of the above. But everyone else affiliated with one denomination or another. And why is that? To me, that says so much about where our country is with this understanding of what religion and what worship is, and just how much game playing is going on, just how much we're all sort of guilty for playing this game. And as long as they keep coming forward with the gold coin and the notes, we're going to keep playing. There's some of this peeling back that needs to take place so that we really challenge one another to know, what is worship really about? What is it that we're really doing here? So I'm going to take an honest look at why we're here, and I'm at least going to try to peel it back a little ways. And I want to suggest that to begin with, there's two ways that we might think about God. And one way is the most familiar. I call it Western theology at its core. Now, and I'm going to eventually have one of these high-tech things where you can actually draw on the iPad Pro, and it will show up on the screen. But for now, I want you to use your brain, your head, and your imagination, and I want you to draw a big circle in your mind, right? And that's God. And then you take it and you draw a tiny little circle right next to it, and that's you, or me, or people. The tiny little circle and the big circle next to it. That's Western theology, except that it used to have a beard on it, the big circle. So this idea of God as basically a projection, in theological terms or sort of casual terms, we call it a super being kind of idea of God, kind of a supernatural understanding of God. Now, hang on to this, because I know some of you are going like, wait a minute. Okay, I can do without the beard on this thing. But what are you saying about my God here? Just realize, relax, this is a metaphor. I'm only giving you metaphors because that's all we got when we try to understand who God is. But basically, this idea of the super being is this idea of a better version of ourselves. We are knowing, God is all-knowing. We are strong and powerful, God is all-powerful. We get around, we're here and we're there, God is everywhere all the time. So we have this bigger version of who God is. And this has been with us since the earliest days of Judeo-Christian worship. More closer to the turning of the millennium, to like 200 BC or 100 BC. Prior to that, God was still located in the temple, but God had a different way of being experienced in objects. In present moments, God could animate anything in the Old Testament. But now we have this idea of God as sort of super being and us as sort of small being. So I want to think with you, if we say worship in that context, then what is worship? Kind of traditionally what we've experienced is worship. The way we connect with God is through traditional forms of prayer, is through traditional forms of worship, music, that sort of thing. And yet, I'm going to suggest there's another way of experiencing God that is far more profound and powerful, and is also ancient. And even Jesus talked about it. And that's where you draw the big circle, and then you put the little circle right inside it. And then to even add some more interest to it, you make that little circle a dotted line, because it's not fixed. And then to even add more fun to it, you make the big circle a dotted line, because that too is not fixed. It becomes permeable. It becomes interrelational. It becomes interactive. It becomes the very ground of our being that we experience from one moment to the next. I want to suggest that if we worship that way, that's more challenging for us, is this idea of how do we worship, in fact, if we are worshiping the ground of our being. So I'm going to ask it again because I want you to think about this. How do we worship if what we're worshiping is the ground of our being? Because in traditional ideas, if it's a big circle and we're a little circle, we think of worship in terms of absolute humility and sort of abject humility in front of this bigness, this awesomeness of God. And then we sometimes sort of think of this bigness and awesomeness of God as kind of like our best friend. And God will do things for us, and when we need God, God will change things for us. But it still becomes this very removed sort of super version of ourselves until that stops working or making sense. I've told this before. I was telling, I think I told Todd this earlier, or somebody I was talking before the service began. I want to tell you a joke, and I'm guessing that 30% of you weren't here when I told it before, so I'm going to tell it again. But these two boys were sitting in the pastor's office, and this pastor was looking very stern. These two boys had been in some trouble, and they were brothers, one a little bit younger than the other one, and so the youngest one was inside the pastor's office while the other one was sitting sort of in the waiting area, and they were both going to have a come to Jesus kind of conversation for some of the stuff they've been doing. And so the pastor looks at him and he says, Jimmy, now you know what's right and wrong. And Jimmy kind of smiled and he says, okay, then I want you to tell me, where is God? And Jimmy's eyes kind of went wide and he wasn't sure what he was being asked. And so the pastor said, Jimmy, tell me, where is God? And Jimmy started getting scared, and then the pastor said, Jimmy, where is God? And Jimmy jumped up, and he ran out the pastor's door and out the waiting room, and then his brother jumped up behind him and started chasing him down the hall and down the street. Jimmy got to their house, ran up the stairs, and into his bedroom closet, slammed the door. His brother finally came up the stairs, into the closet, slammed behind him, said, Jimmy, what happened? What did he say to you? Jimmy said, I don't know, God's missing, and they think we did it. Right? There's this idea, right? So we can laugh about it because it is kind of ridiculous. It is kind of strange, this idea that God is so removed from us that God becomes more a projection of what we want God to be, when in fact God is far more mysterious, and we run the very risk of missing what true worship looks like. And Jesus says what it is, and Amos said what it was, and that is compassion and justice. But I want to play with another idea really quickly, just so I don't take up too much time, because we're going to do communion together. Okay, good. I want to suggest one thing further. The word worship, if you go to its root, it's really amazing. What it means is worthiness. It means worth. The Old English word means to find worth, and if you look at the word ship, it means to carry or to hold. So that worship actually means to find worth, to hold worth, to carry worth. And if we're worshiping at the very ground of our being, then I think we got some work to do. It gives us this opportunity to find that worthiness in every moment, to bring compassion and justice and a deeper sense of connection to every moment that we have, to see one another as of supreme worth, to, as we've often said, to see Christ in one another. But more than simply that, because the challenge for us is that a lot of us don't always experience that sense of worth. I mean, we go through ups and downs. We don't always feel worthy. We doubt ourselves all the time. Sometimes we doubt others. We look at others. We get angry with others. It's challenging to find the worthiness in every moment. It's also a lot of fun. The practice of finding worth in the moment begins to change something. It begins to change you. Not the other person. It may change the other person too. It may change the creation if we're tending a garden. It may change a group of people if we're finding the worth in that. But it's changing us from within to find that worth. So that idea of worth, or I'm going to play with it and call it worthiness, that if we look for that sense of worthiness in things, that we are really actually participating with this idea of being in the ground of our very being with God. And it's not anything new, as I said, because if you go to the story where Jesus was talking to the woman the Samaritan woman at the well, and you might remember that story, and he says, why are you here? You shouldn't be talking to Samaritan women. And the disciples are saying the same thing. What are you doing talking to Samaritan people anyway? And then it's a woman on top of that, and you're drawing water from her well. That's Jacob's well. They worship differently. She even tells them we worship differently. She says, we worship from the mountain. You all worship in the temple. Jesus says, yeah, but neither one's where you're going to end up worshiping. He said, I tell you pretty soon, nobody will worship the mountain. They won't worship the temple. They'll be worshiping in spirit. He already is challenging this idea that worship is this institutional thing. But instead, worship is relational. And that, I think, is the real challenge and opportunity for us as people who say we follow Christ or we follow the way of Jesus, is that it gives us a chance to see not just others' worthiness, but our own worthiness, our own value in what we can bring to the moment. Someone caught me outside earlier this morning, and I had been talking to her in another context, and we've talked about this in here before. A lot of us don't carry around narratives of worthiness, you know. A lot of us grew up in different family situations. We have different issues going on in our lives, and we often carry some pretty broken narratives. And finding that worthiness is pretty challenging for us. And so what I suggested to her that she just simply change the parameters. Because what we do with worship and what we do with our vision of God and what we do with how we see one another is simply things that we have either been given, and so we're kind of entrained into it, kind of enculturated into it, and we hang on to these things as if they're fact, when they're just parameters. They're just arbitrary parameters that need to be changed when they're not working. And so I said, change the parameters of your narrative. Stop defining yourself in those terms and define yourself in a new term. And if it's hard, just play with it and make it up. And so she caught me this morning because she said, I got to tell you, I did it earlier in the week. And my sister said, what happened to you? She said, because your mood's all sorts of different. And she said, it's working. And I said, what did I do? And she said, well, we'll have to talk, because I forgot exactly what I told her to do to make that happen. But she simply said, we are not necessarily the stories that we tell ourselves. We don't have to be. We are part of this greater circle of being. And our lines inside this circle are not solid, they're permeated. And even the greater being that we live within is also permeated. The only thing that makes it all work, are you ready for this? The only thing that makes it work is worship. It only works if we practice worship, if we practice bringing worthiness to the moment. And hopefully that's why you're here. Hopefully that's what you get to experience when you're here, is this reminder of finding worthiness in one another and finding it in ourselves, and maybe remembering, oh yeah, I forgot. I go back to my normal routine. God's a big circle, I'm a little circle. And I'm still looking for ways to find solutions to these problems, instead of realizing you're in the very midst of being of God's possibilities. And all we have to do to get there is to worship. Amen.